Our worthy forefathers, let's give them a cheer. To climates unknown did courageously steer. Through oceans to deserts for freedom they came, and dying bequeathed us their freedom and fame. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready, steady, friends, steady. Not as slaves, but as free men, our money will give.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the fall semester of the Historical Society of Old Abington's Conversations. We're doing things a little bit different today. We're still fighting a pandemic, so we normally do this with a full audience who can participate in conversations. Today we are virtual. We are in the back room of the Dyer Memorial Library in Abington, and we are starting our first of 3 fall semester programs that will all be virtual. And we'll see what happens by spring. But let's start today's program the way we start all of our programs, and that's with a salute to the flag. You may join me in doing so at home. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I think I just said individual instead of indivisible. There's a flaw for you, but that's okay. I'm good with that. I make mistakes occasionally. So anyway, as I mentioned, we're doing our fall semester now. Today's topic is the business of dying. It's a program that we had originally scheduled for last spring, but our last spring programs got canceled by the beginning of April. And in the 1st of November, we're going to do a field trip to Rockland, to the GAR Hall. We're going to be talking about Grand Army of the Republic halls in general, but that is the one that's still standing, still in good shape, and worth touring. We'll also talk about Abington's building, which still stands, but it's no longer the same function, and Whitman's, which burned. We'll end up the fall semester in early December with a review of what was originally St. Mark's Lutheran Church and more recently Joy in Christ Lutheran Church. As we're speaking now, they have closed and they are in the process of selling the building, but we're hoping to do a walk-through tour of the building as it is now and as it was used, and talk with a few people who have been in on the congregation from the start. Also, where there appears to be a buyer on the horizon, we're hoping by early December to have a chance to sit down and talk with the new owners of the building and talk about their intentions. My understanding is it will stay a church. Then we'll take a break in January and February and come back in March with a timely topic. Now, we don't know what the spring will bring, whether, again, we'll be virtual or whether we'll be able to welcome back an audience. But the topic will be the Spanish flu, deja vu all over again. We've had a couple of pandemics, polio certainly since, and a few others, but having looked at it, I think there's a lot of interesting comparisons to the Spanish flu of 17 to 18, 1819, anyway, the later part of the 19 teens. And we can talk about how that was fought and resolved and how it compares to how we're dealing with COVID-19. By April, we'll be talking about law and order, policing in the old towns. The 3 towns that make up our area of interest, Abington, Rockland, and Whitman, all have relatively new police stations. But how did they get there? And where were they before? How did they develop? So we will have at least one guest talking about that, and we'll be looking at the 3 stations and the 3 towns. The 3 towns were one town until the 1870s. And the modern day policing needs have changed so much with modern crime and modern technology. So we'll be looking at that in early April. And then we'll end up our spring semester in May talking about new acquisitions at the Historical Society of Old Abington and the Dyer Memorial Library. A lot of stuff come in the doors here throughout the course of the year, and we don't really get a chance to show it off, and you folks really have no way of knowing what it is we have. So every now and then we like to take a step back and kind of do a show and tell. And it's fascinating stuff. It always is. But as I said, we just don't have much of a chance to show it off. So we'll take time to do that in May. I think we also have an annual meeting coming up around then, and maybe election of officers. So if you're interested in serving, we're interested in having you. Okay, and on to today's topic. Very important stuff. The business of dying. There was no pandemic going when we scheduled this a year ago. We just thought it was interesting where each of the three towns in our purview had basically family-run funeral facilities, and most of them were in historic homes. So how did they get there? What's the history of them? How do they relate? And how has the business evolved and changed over the years? In the United States, early on, burial and funeral rites were very much an at-home thing. It wasn't unusual to have a family cemetery, and the notion of undertakers and funeral parlors was just not heard of. It was, again, a very much at-home affair. It actually even influenced architecture through the time, and as an architect, I feel I need to address that. Some early colonial homes actually had doors in particular places, in particular rooms where they were likely to have a viewing or a funeral at home to get the casket in and out, because oftentimes the front halls were too tight and too small, and it was necessary to actually install a door that was only used when you were removing a casket from the house. Later, it's not an uncommon feature, particularly in homes of the later half of the 19th century, to find a box bay window in the parlor. And again, it was a place where a casket could be displayed. And from outside, one could see that something was there, and there were flowers, and it was a place to display. So the notion of the term funeral parlor, guess what? That's about where it came from. Things changed drastically right around the time of the Civil War. Suddenly, there was a need to take the bodies of the fallen soldiers and ship them home. But that wasn't practical without taking some further means to preserve them so they could come home somewhat intact, or at least as intact as they could. So the practice of embalming in this country took hold and changed the whole scene. I mean, suddenly we had professionals, we had businesses growing up, and we began to transition from a home-based sort of folksy approach to dealing with death and dying to actually, again, funeral homes, funeral parlors, where this was handled professionally by people who were qualified to embalm and deal with a lot of the issues around death and dying. And it certainly got the notion of dealing with death every moment, because having a body in the house, to actually removing it to a professional facility where everyone could go and visit it in a different manner, in a different presentation. Now, I'd like to look at the history of three particular funeral homes in the three towns. We're going to start with Abington, then go to Whitman, and then to Rockland. And I have some presentations that will begin to address that. If I can scan through them here. Here we go. The first one is in Abington, and it's Quailey's funeral home at 116 Adams Street. I've done a little bit of research on my own. There was a wonderful article written back in 2005 by then chairman of the Abington Historic Commission, Sharon Orchid Peters, and it talked about how the Quaileys acquired the building in 1947. Bob and Gertrude started it, and then, with great success there, they, in 1966, actually purchased some adjacent properties, and it's about where the parking lot is now, so it expanded that and gave them a little more versatility, get a few cars off the street. That's a mean intersection. And Bill Quailey, their son, took over in 1977. He took over the management, and of course now his son Rob is very much the family business. So we're looking at 3 generations there. What we didn't know historically about this particular building, and I was curious about it, was, well, who originally built it? How did it come to us originally? And it's very easy nowadays to research a deed online and trace it back through the years. And I traced it back to 1895 and found, interestingly, that Lewis Abbott Crossett, now, okay, who is that? The building most of us know as New England Art was originally built as Crossett Shoes, and Lewis Abbott Crossett was the owner of that enterprise. Very well known, very charitable guy through town. He actually gave us the eagle on top of Memorial Arch at Island Grove, very generous man. And I knew that he had sold or given some land to one of his executives about 2 doors away from this. And I was suspicious that this could have somehow been related. And the deed I found said in February of 1895, Lewis Abbott Crossett sold the property to Frederick Merrill Pettingill. And that's where my research stops for the moment. I don't know if he was an officer of the company, but there was some reason that Lewis Abbott Crossett decided to sell it to the Pettingills. They were only there for 5 or 10 years, so whatever the arrangement was, it didn't last. But they were the creators of that building that we now know as Quailey's Funeral Home. So that's kind of where that stands. Now let's jump to Whitman. This is the newest facility we're talking about here, and this is the Mckinnon Funeral Home. But the other historical significance, and the reason we're looking at a building that was built in 1933, is the building was built by Francis Cardinal Spellman for his parents. And it was their home, and he was, at the time, Auxiliary Bishop of Boston. And of course, he ascended through the ranks, but it was in the family for some time to come. And it was 1.45 acres, 7 baths, a former built-in pool. It was quite elegant for its day. And anyway, it remained in the family until 1974, when the Johnson's funeral home purchased it, and then the McKinnons after that. So they are still running it as well, and in, I believe, the front hall, there is a little memorial piece to the Cardinal, Francis Cardinal Spellman. So the business is very much up and running and well-liked, and it's beautifully appointed, it is, but that's why we look at this particular residence, even though it's one of the newer ones. And last but certainly not least, in Rockland, we have what is now the Biggins Funeral Home. This is a very early photograph of it. This building is actually on the National Register of Historic Places as part of the South Union Historic District, number 135 Union Street. Not long ago, the Dyer published an article about the original construction of the building when C.W. Torrey built it. He was in the shoe trade and had a rather large shoe factory right out back. But the shoe factory obviously is gone, and the building passed down through the family and eventually was purchased by Wendell Magoon, and later passed through the family to Robert Magoon. And more recently was joined by the Biggins family, where Bob ran it for many years. And unfortunately, we lost him a couple of years ago, but already on board was Dan. And Dan is now running it and carrying on his family tradition with the establishment. We're honored today to have Dan with us, and I'm going to take a little camera break here, and we're going to invite Dan to come up and sit across from me and talk about the present funeral business today and how it affects local town, the local economy, just how we live our lives, basically, or how we end our lives, I suppose. What's the line? Nothing's sure except death and taxes. So anyway, we'll take a brief pause and invite Dan to join me. Thank you. Okay, so we are back, and to my right is Dan Biggins. Dan, welcome.
Thank you, Doug.
Well, thank you for joining us here today.
It's really great to be here. Thank you.
I'm so happy, and what we're looking at on screen is, of course, your facility. You've done some work to this recently.
Yes,
some
sir, we
painting
have.
and
Yes,
fixing
sir, we
up.
have. We're doing some. We did some exterior work to it. It needed to be painted. The parking lot needed to be done. And we also just put in a new cafe room in the basement that's available for families to be able to have, muffins, light fare,
Oh,
to
nice.
be able to visit. It's a children's room for people to be able to have their children at a wake and be able to, gather together in a different, more comfortable space too. So we're doing a little bit of different things with the building.
So it's becoming very family-oriented.
We're trying to make it so, yes.
Which-
Try to make it as comfortable for people in 2020 as we possibly
Again,
can.
a different direction for the business, which we're going to talk about that more, I think. But I think what I'd like to do is start by talking about the type of traditional services that are offered by funeral homes like yours. Frankly, I co-opted this from the Quailey site. They gave good explanations about a lot of things, but I mean, this starts talking about from the time someone is deceased to transporting them to caring for the deceased body and chatting with the family to decide what is going to be done, dealing with the legality of medical certificates and death certificates and any permits and whatever. I don't know, is there anything particularly here you want to expound on, or you think that maybe isn't well known, or what? I throw it to you.
I'd be happy to. Thanks, Doug. So what you're looking at right here is a really good, I would say, traditional outline of a lot of the services that a local traditional funeral home might provide. There's also a lot that we provide and that we do for folks that changes every day that you may not see up here. But starting at the top, I know there you see the transfer of a deceased from their place of death to the funeral home. And of course, a funeral home or a family never knows the time or place of a death or when that might happen. Funeral homes that local ones I know of anyway are usually available 24/7.
They need to be
able to be called, and you need to be. So because death, it doesn't just happen on Monday or Friday. It happens on weekends and holidays and middles of nights, and we're always there at a moment's notice to help a family out, even whether it be to take a deceased into our care or to help them with questions along the line of the difficult road that they're going down. But when we get that phone call, we have a care team that goes right out into a person's home. We try to be very sensitive to the fact that we're going into someone's home or hospital or nursing home, and try to be as well dressed and professional and kind and empathetic as we can. We try to, when we get to the place of death, we try to make sure that the family's had enough time to be with their loved ones, make sure that they've, if they have any questions, that the folks that are there, that are the professionals, they're taking their loved one into their care, we're able to answer them for them in the best way that we can. And then after that happens, we usually set a time for the family to come in, and we begin the arrangement process, which deals with a lot of the things that you see here. Professional care of the deceased, I think that's the next thing that says about sanitary washing and embalming. And really, in my opinion, that might be some of the most important work that my firm does. When a family trusts my firm, or really any firm, with their loved one, it's someone's mom, their dad, in some cases, unfortunately, their child. They're putting an extraordinary amount of trust in us to take care of someone they love. So we treat people like ladies and like gentlemen, and it's our goal to take care of them in a physical manner no differently than we would for our own mom and dad. You mentioned my dad recently died a couple of years back, and my mom 5 years
Before
back.
that,
Yeah, and that's our goal, from myself to my whole care team to the folks that take care of the yard, that we take care of each family, that we take care of as if they were our own, no differently than we did my own mom or dad.
Sure.
So we always find that that's very important, is the physical care of the deceased. Just a bit to touch on embalming. A lot of people think embalming's this really terribly invasive process. And we're told by media and culture these days that that's the case, but it's really not. It's really a minor procedure that our team takes very great care in to make sure that a family has a good opportunity to say goodbye, a good memory, and to just make sure that we take care of the public health and sanitation process as well. Yeah. Going down, I think you mentioned a little bit about legalities and signing of death certificates and paperwork and obtaining information from families. One of the first steps that we take in planning a funeral is gathering of biographical information from a family, things that we use for things like filing of death certificates with the state or any other legal documentation that may need to take place. We also use this opportunity to get to know the family a little bit, to build a rapport, to get an idea of what's important to them in the days to come. And we try to help them to be able to get there and take care of all the logistics, to help them care for their loved one and celebrate their life in the way that's appropriate to them as a family. Going down, it says about obtaining and preparing an obituary to be placed in a newspaper. A lot of times they go in the newspaper, but it's funny, a lot of times as time goes on, we're talking about things changing.
Yeah.
A lot of folks aren't putting them in newspapers. We have the advent, of course, of the internet, and
Right.
a lot of online obituaries are going online, and people are finding out about funeral events in that way differently than they might have a generation ago.
Now, there's a difference between a death notice and an obituary, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
If you were to put it in a print publication, the difference between a death notice and an obituary would be that a death notice is what's called, also known as a paid death notice, which is usually the shorter version that you would see in a newspaper.
Okay.
The obituary would be a longer, more biographical, colorful story, if you will. It's more of a story of a person's life. Oftentimes papers, particularly a couple of our local papers here on the South Shore, have combined the two.
Okay.
So they're not so much separate anymore. For example, the Ledger and Enterprise locally run one thing that's called a paid death notice or obituary. So it's really all one thing.
Okay.
But a lot of times, I mentioned the digital online space. A lot of funeral homes, including mine, will list obituaries on their website that have the ability for the public to interact with. It becomes sort of dynamic. The public's able to, leave memories in guest books or send messages directly to the family or view an online video tribute. So things really, I think, have changed, and I think families are embracing, in a lot of cases, these change for ways to memorialize or to celebrate their loved ones.
Well, another aspect of that, and maybe it's the age I am myself right now, but I find myself logging on to, for instance, your webpage or your facility's webpage and looking at recent notices and saying, oh, I didn't know they died. But there it is. And it's been a source of information for me to find out what I might have missed, because the listings last for a while, certainly.
Absolutely.
And it's been useful for that every now and then just want to kind of catch up.
Some folks even take advantage of the ability to subscribe to the obituaries on these websites.
I wasn't even aware of that.
Yeah, so you could absolutely get an alert or a notification
Okay.
every time there was an obituary posted that would come to your mailbox letting you know that a local death had occurred.
And is that a box I can click on your website?
Sure is.
Oh, there you go.
Sure is.
Okay.
Yeah, sure is. Yeah.
I may do that.
Yes.
Cool.
So
And-
I guess, the other thing that you see here is notifying family and friends, and that's part of what the obituary does.
Right.
And I think the space about the online space really has become quite dynamic in, modern times too, I mentioned it being on the webpage, but people also interact out there in social media.
Right.
Whether it be on Facebook or Instagram or any other of these models that people have, they're able to interact and share stories and media. It's really, particularly in a time of COVID where we're not able to gather as a public as much as we were, families, I think, have really embraced the online platform.
Sure, because also it addresses distance.
Absolutely.
I mean, you can be in California and still feel you're somewhat a part of something happening in Abington, Rockland, or Whitman.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Webcasting of funerals has become
yes, particularly in
commonality.
COVID.
Yes, because
Yeah.
of COVID. A lot of the churches will have, maximum numbers, small maximum numbers
Right.
that families are allowed to have into the church. So there might be additional family members that can't travel in or aren't able to come in due to the numbers, and
Right.
they're able to take part and to be able to feel as though that they're part of that celebration, at least in a digital sense.
Virtual like we are today.
Exactly. Yes, sir.
we've had
Exactly
to
right.
adapt on the same concerns. So
Exactly.
that's amazing how it's affecting all of us, but we're all adapting.
Absolutely, we need to. I mean,
I
we really,
agree.
and every day is different, and we don't know really when this is going to end. And
Right.
we're talking a lot about funeral service and how it's changed, over time and the length of years. But I think a lot of us in the profession may agree that it's changed exponentially in the last 6 months.
Yes.
Just in
What you
dealing
can and
with
can't do.
what you can and can't do, and
Yeah.
what we're trying to do to sort of. And I don't want to choose the term get around it. It's not get around it, but choose something that is appropriate that allows the family and the community to acknowledge death and to celebrate somebody within the rigorous restraints that we have.
I think
currently
respond
at the
to is
time.
perhaps a correct
Yeah,
way to phrase
exactly,
it.
correct.
It's not working around, it's working with.
With, exactly.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
I
Mitigating,
appreciate that. Yeah,
mitigating.
that makes a big difference. Anyway, what else are we dealing with here?
So I have one here that catches my eye, and it says
Yeah,
about
go.
arranging of pallbearers, and that's one little small piece about arranging of pallbearers, but I think that is a great way for participation. People like to grieve, whether it be existentially in the family or by taking part. Sometimes people send flowers. Sometimes people send a fruit arrangement or send a message or make a phone call. Allowing families to take part in funeral services are really a gift to give somebody. And when folks are invited to be a pallbearer or to do a reading or to make a slideshow or a song playlist for a funeral, it really makes a unique and important goal of making this sort of a unique celebration of a person's life, while also giving someone that gift of that invitation to be a part of it.
Okay.
So we try to make our services to be as inclusive as we can and to bring as many people in to collaborate to produce a really special service if possible.
You know, I also feel we're seeing a lot less in the way of church services, that really most things are happening at the facility as opposed to then going to a church. Is perhaps the exception to that the Catholic Church, or am I being too broad in this?
Well, no, I think that you're, and again, pre-COVID, I think might have been a little bit different too.
Right.
But I think you're hitting the nail on the head a little bit. It used to be that in the beginning of my career, I've been a funeral director for just over 20 years now, which isn't a long, I mean, it's a long enough
That's
time.
long enough.
It's long enough to know that, things at one time were quite different. And when I first came into the business, our funeral home was still known as the Protestant Funeral Home
Yes.
in Rockland. And the other funeral home, the Sullivan Funeral Home in Rockland, at that time was
The
known as
Catholic,
the
yeah.
Catholic Funeral
Right.
Home in Rockland. And how quickly sort of times have changed, that sort of the two firms both started doing all faiths. But not only that we started doing things that were of other faiths, and that we were doing things that don't necessarily involve faith.
At all.
So a lot of these funerals, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on the family, were moved from the church and may have come into a funeral home or in a different space. And that became very common, I think, whether it be for a period of time, whether it be for sort of less people less invested in their religious faith might be part of it, but also I think for logistical simplicity, some people chose that. But again, getting to the COVID change.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of the funeral homes just don't have the space that these churches have, and given the current pandemic rules, a lot of us can't have a whole lot of people in our buildings right now to be able to have a funeral service. So,
But a lot of the churches are closed.
exactly.
So, I mean, that's
so we're
the
doing a
as
lot
well.
of services in cemeteries, if that's an option, or trying to find other mitigating options for people.
Yeah.
So, but to your point, yeah, things did change quite a bit over the years.
Right.
We are still doing quite a bit of funerals in Catholic churches, as you mentioned. With the occasional services in Protestant churches.
Right.
Maybe not quite as much as it was those 20
Well, I
years
just
ago.
personalize it for a moment. When my father passed away, who was a fairly popular figure and a big war hero, we were dealing with your facility at the time and had the phone call saying, we won't be able to handle the crowd.
Right.
And so we ended up moving it to United Church of Christ in Abington, where I was working as music director at the time, so it was a fairly easy transition. But it was practicality that caused us to need a larger facility.
Absolutely.
And that worked out.
Yeah,
But our intention, honestly, was to keep it simple and keep it at your facility. We couldn't.
Sure. And every family has a different challenge and has a different need. There are some families that are very, very small families, or that may not have people that live locally, and having a funeral in a large building like a church may not feel appropriate to them. It may not feel quite as intimate.
Might have felt less intimate, more out of scale.
Yeah. And, in 2020, I mean, whether it be faith or not even to do with the church, people are really doing very, very different things, things that I never even maybe would have imagined. Sometimes folks are having funeral services on a boat, or they may be doing something on a beach. We help them with that. It's not something that they're doing on their own. We are very helpful in trying to help them build creative and appropriate services for them.
But there still are legalities that have to be dealt with, and things that need to be done, no matter how creative you want to get.
Absolutely.
There still are rules and regs.
Rules, regs, and also best practice, without a doubt.
Good term.
And funeral homes are very highly regulated, not only here in Massachusetts, but
We're going to
nationally.
talk about that in a bit, I think. I'd like to actually move on and talk about another aspect of the business, cremation. We're hearing a lot more about it. Well, I don't know. What can you tell me about it? I was surprised, first of all, let me just share this. I always thought that what you got back was ashes. Well, there's not much in the way of ashes. I mean, it's bone fragments you're getting. It's still the remains of a person.
Yes.
But that's what it is.
Yeah, well, I would say it's ashes. There is still bone fragments within it, for certain. There is a process that the crematories take to make sure that it is broken down into a fine ash sort of.
Something that can be handled.
Exactly correct.
Absolutely.
Exactly correct.
Advantages, disadvantages. What brings people to that? Why would one do that, I guess, is the simple question.
So I don't know if it's advantage or disadvantage, but more, I would say, appropriate and fitting for necessarily a family, whether it be for their needs or their budget. In some cases, cremation can be less expensive than burial, in the sense that when there is a cremation, there is not the need to purchase cemetery property or to open a grave. In cemeteries locally here around in the South Shore, when we have a full traditional burial with a casket, cemeteries also require what's called an outer burial container or burial vault, which is a concrete box or vault that's placed into the grave prior to the casket. And that's required for a burial too. So these are items that are required for purchase when we have a traditional burial.
Right.
But when we have a cremation, you don't necessarily have to do that.
Okay.
Cremation does not mean the absence of services, though, or the absence
Right.
of a funeral. I think a lot of people assume that when they say I'm going to be cremated, that's simply the only thing that's going to happen. Cremation we really view as no differently than burial. It's just a mode of interment. A lot of folks commonly will have visitation or a wake or a Catholic funeral or a different funeral, and still following that, still go ahead off and just have a different type of interment, which would be, in this case, cremation,
Right.
Which can allow people to do some different things.
I agree.
Nowadays, people spread ashes some places. Nowadays, people have jewelry that they use, that they incorporate, that might have cremated remains with
Oh,
them.
that's right. I've heard about that one too.
So
yeah.
there's lots of
Yeah.
different things that people do.
I've heard of
that
ashes.
cremation may allow that maybe burial doesn't. So
Right.
while it may be a cost consideration, it isn't always that. It's just what a person's particular need is and what's appropriate and special for them. And
Certainly.
we try to answer their questions and try to help them make a good decision. I don't know that one is better for me, better than for you. It's just
Right.
really an important family decision.
I've even seen a blend. I mean, I had an aunt and uncle, and the uncle passed away first. He was cremated. And when my aunt passed away, they included his ashes in her. I don't think it was in the coffin, but it was in the liner or something like
Sure.
that. But I mean, they found a way to combine both parents in one
Sure.
burial, which I thought was creative.
It is, and you know, we shouldn't assume that spouses or family are always going to choose the same thing.
Right.
Different people have
Right.
different wishes, and we like to call that a talk of a lifetime. It's
Yeah,
important
good.
to do that.
Yeah,
it's important to do that.
That people know.
Right. A quick story. I mean, my own personal experience. I shared already about my mom and dad.
Yeah.
My mom was sick with breast cancer for 10 years, and my dad and I, occupational hazard, had the unfortunate opportunity to talk quite a bit and plan out in
Yeah.
detail what her funeral would look like.
Right.
For more than a year, we talked about that, and we were prepared to the T. And God, when we lost my mom, my dad and I were heartbroken, and we really couldn't be funeral directors. So fortunately, we had a great team that works with us at Biggins Funeral Home, and we had this pre-arrangement file, and they were able to pick it up and work with it because we had planned my mom's funeral. It
Right.
just made that day
Right.
so much easier for us. Now, fast forward a couple of years, and my dad, after my mom's death, and my dad is doing great. He's lost 60 pounds. He's having the time of his life.
In Florida, I think.
He was
at
in
the time.
Florida.
Yeah.
He was engaged to be married to a
Yeah.
wonderful lady, and they were watching spring training at the Red Sox facility down there, and he had a massive brain aneurysm and died. And despite being a funeral director for as long as he was, and talking quite a bit about the importance of pre-arranging, guess
Surprise.
what? He didn't pre-arrange.
Yeah.
And as a son, and as somebody who is now needing to be a funeral director for my dad,
Yep.
I was able to firsthand experience, realize how important it was from my family to have had the opportunity to sort of plan out my mom's funeral beforehand. Because with my dad, it was just a much different thing.
You were
It
winging
was harder. It was, well, we were winging it. I had
Yeah.
to ask myself, what would have Dad wanted? What songs did Dad like?
Yeah.
What would Dad wanted his funeral to be like?
Right.
And there's still some speculation of whether I got it right or not. But with my mom, we knew, we talked about it.
You probably
know?
got it right.
Oh, I think I did, but you know what I mean. You know what I,
do.
mean, and family's
I do,
mine.
by all means. Yeah.
So it's important, I think.
Okay. And talking about some other trends in the industry, green burial is a new thing. And I'm hearing it a lot more. I actually had one of my other directors who couldn't be here today, he just had a hip or a knee replaced or something, say, ask about green burial. And I said, Okay, and I know a little bit about it. Are we seeing a lot of it? What differences does it entail from traditional burial? I'm assuming the service doesn't need to be particularly different, or viewings or anything else, but what happens next?
So I think nationally we're seeing more and more of this. Talking to my colleagues on a national scale, you hear more of it. In different, even parts of the state, you hear about more of it. Here on the South Shore, you don't hear a whole lot about green burials. Part of the reason is I think some of it may be cultural, just for the people that are living in our area. And other pieces...
They're used to what they're used to.
Yeah. The mores and traditions are sort of set sort of heavily in us and in our hearts. But for green burial also, you need to have a cemetery that will allow for it. Locally here in our surrounding towns, there is not a cemetery that I'm aware of that is allowing for green burials. Right.
We maybe need to talk to them.
Yeah. So a true green burial would be when a person is not embalmed, not prepared in any way. They're typically wrapped in some sort of a biodegradable wrapping and placed in the ground with the absence of a casket or the absence of or outer burial container. And in some cases, there is sort of an adjustment that can be made in local cemeteries where the outer burial container, which typically has a lid, may be placed upside down in a grave over the top of a casket. So that the earth and elements are able to be exactly correct.
Okay.
So it's sort of a mitigation of the wish to have a green burial, but maybe not a true and authentic green burial.
It's a compromise.
It is.
Which will meet regulations, perhaps.
It does. And I know you have another guest that's going to talk more about this in a minute. But the Jewish faith does this each and every single day. This is how they do their
That's their tradition.
I know he'll be able to talk more with you about that.
Absolutely. A couple of things. I had a local minister I was chatting with about this who does a lot of, I'll name names. I was chatting with Christy Coburn, who does a lot of funerals, and I consider her very good at them, and I know you people work with her a lot. And she asked me to be sure to mention that for you guys, this is an avocation. This isn't just a job.
Yes.
And I thought it was a significant comment because, I mean, you came to this through the family business.
Yes.
Your brother didn't, you did. But, I mean, this is something you've chosen to do in the way you choose to live your life. And it, as you said, it can happen any time of the day or night or any day of the week and everything. So it's something that can consume your life, I think.
It does. To be honest, Doug, growing up through and including into high school, being a funeral director was the last thing I wanted to be. And it's because of exactly what you just said. It's because I grew up watching my dad. I admired my dad. I admired the work that he did, but I did watch how being a funeral director did consume his life. And maybe it did not that it consumed his life, but it is who he was. It is absolutely who he was. And I'm not sure as a young man I quite understood that yet. Later on in between my junior and senior year summers of high school, I had the chance to go to work for him, and I was able to firsthand see sort of the impact, the social impact that he made on people, and how he was able to help people at the worst time of their lives. And I decided at that point that I wanted to be a funeral director.
Sure.
And now that I've sort of grown up doing it and loving it, I've noticed that it's sort of become who I am as well. We live in a small little community, our town of Rockland and Abington and Whitman, and we're taking care of our neighbors, we're taking care of our friends. The folks that are my clients are the kids that play on my kids' basketball teams. So it really is a gift for me to do what I do. I'm not selling a widget. We're not making Nikes. We're doing a real human act of empathy and kindness for somebody. And we found a way to make it our living and to make it our job. While we have difficult days and there are hard cases, and some days I go home and I'm crying in my wife's arms because of something difficult that happened that day, inevitably I go home with my heart full because I know that I'm doing something real and important for someone.
Making a difference.
Yeah.
Interesting, and I certainly appreciate that. Now, you personally have also gotten more involved in the community. You've served on the school committee?
Yes, sir. Yeah. Okay. I served for 6 years on the school committee in Rockland. I was the chairman for quite a few years, and then decided to take a step back, and I did not run. But then my good friend, Mr. Phelps, who's a long time Rockland School Committee member, due to health reasons had to step back, and I accepted an appointment to finish out his term for him.
Back in the game.
Back in the game, yeah. Trying to help out with this back to school and crazy
and again, in a very
hybrids.
difficult time.
It is, yes, sir. Yeah.
Dealing with a lot of other issues you deal with, which is kind of an interesting aspect of it, too.
Indeed, yes, sir. Indeed.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, I have one final question for you.
Please.
Most unusual? I mean, I've heard of burial at sea. I've heard of, you mentioned beaches and everything else. Is there one that sticks out? I'm not asking for specifics, but just generally, is there one particular service or set of services you offered or something that sticks out in your mind?
I can think of a couple.
Okay. Well,
All right,
choose
so-
one. I'm only going to give you one.
All right, so we'll do one.
Okay, one.
I'll do my top one. My favorite one was this was a cremation funeral, and we talked about how cremation is not just disposition. There's lots of different ways you can celebrate a person's life.
Right.
They make an urn that is made for the purpose of spreading ashes in the water. It's made of a biodegradable material, and it's placed on a body of water with the ashes in it, and it sort of slowly drifts out and dissipates, and the ashes are spread into the body of water under it.
Is this like a chlorine distributor for a
Something
pool?
like that.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of almost
There you
something
go.
like that. Something like that.
Something everyone can relate to.
So the gentleman in question that I'm talking about was a really good golfer. He played golf at Rockland Golf Course in the Thursday night golf league there for years and years and years and years and years. And the funeral that we planned for him is that we're on the water trap at Rockland Golf Course. All the golfers that he played in the Thursday night golf league wrote a message on a golf ball, and they all stood around the water hazard, and they put the golf ball on the ground, and the urn was placed in the middle of the pond, and everybody chipped their golf ball into the water with their
that's
message
fun.
to him.
That's fun.
So there's just really great, unique ways to say goodbye. It's not
Yeah.
always in the traditional sense. We always try to tell someone's story. Another one of my favorite sayings is that a funeral is not a day in a lifetime. It's a lifetime in a day.
Clever.
So that's what we try
Did
to
you
do.
make that one up?
I did not.
Okay.
Some of my best ideas are stolen, Doug. So.
That's quite all right.
Yeah.
As long as they're good, we adapt.
Exactly.
Anyway, thank you for being here
Thank
today.
you for having me. This was a pleasure.
We're going to take a little break and invite someone else up, but this has been enlightening, and you're well-spoken on the topic, and
Thank you.
Credit to the community, and I thank you for
having me.
that.
And I'm glad to be in it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug.
Okay, we're going to
All
take
right.
another break. Okay, and we are back, and to my right this time is Mr. Anthony Masseroni, and he is with the Levine Funeral Chapel in Brookline. Do I have that right?
You do.
Okay, and I'll share a personal note here. He's here today on his birthday. I won't mention which one, but he's a good sport for being here today on his birthday. Can you tell us a little bit about Levine Chapels? I don't want to jump back and talk about something I kind of skipped over with Dan, but how about this facility in Brookline?
Sure. So I've been with the chapel now for over 30 years, and this building is our second funeral home. We originated in Dorchester,
Okay.
and in 1943, I believe, the Levine family bought this building from the Coolidge family. This was originally the Calvin Coolidge family farmhouse, and it was a very small building. And the Levine family just held off and waited till all the neighbors sold off. And then we actually
Acquired.
transformed the entire building into what it is today.
Okay.
We have two chapels. One chapel on the left of the building holds over 200 people, and the building on the right holds about 75.
Okay, so a couple of different scales accommodated. And you actually found parking in Brookline?
We bought the next building over,
Okay.
and we turned that into our parking lot.
There you go. That certainly accommodates things. And Tony's here because there's a very, I say, different set of circumstances in dealing with Jewish Jewish burial traditions and Jewish funeral traditions, which we're going to get into in a minute. First, we're going to jump to a topic that I neglected to get into with Dan, and that is talking about prearrangements. And I think this is something that we're seeing a lot more of today. I think it's pretty strictly regulated, perhaps, because of some maybe missteps early on, but can you talk to us about prearrangements?
Well, the two steps of prearrangements.
Okay.
One is simply getting your wishes on paper.
Okay.
Because as we advise most of our families, as we're talking about things now, we're talking with our heads. But the minute a death occurs, you begin to think with your heart.
Okay.
So just getting your wishes on paper, as Dan referred to with his dad and his mom,
Right, the
is the
difference.
important thing.
Yeah.
Is to you can just refer to a file.
Right.
Now, there's prepayment of the prearrangement
Okay.
that is heavily regulated. Massachusetts is a very consumer protective state,
Oh, yeah.
state, and In the past, when you paid a funeral home, we're talking many, many years ago, the funeral home controlled the money, which meant that every organization could do whatever they wanted with the money. Now, with the way state law is now, when you prepay for your funeral, the money immediately, within 10 days, I believe, has to go into an insurance policy or a trust. It is in that person's name. It's still their property. It's not the property of the funeral home, but you can set up your prearrangement as revocable or irrevocable. Many times if you're in a spend down situation, you have to get money out of your hands.
Right.
So you want to do it as an irrevocable account. But it just protects. It protects your money. And by prepaying your funeral, there are some advantages where some services are then guaranteed against inflation.
Okay, that makes sense. And this has become popular, has it not?
Very popular.
Okay.
It's, especially now where families, our lives are just really busy. And to have everything all set, all ready to go, just makes things so much less stressful, where you can deal with your emotion and you can deal with all of that without thinking about everything else.
In my head, I'm hearing that phrase, to not be a burden on my children.
Correct.
Okay, that's just, it's in the parent tapes there somewhere. I'm going to take care of this now. But you also mentioned the financial aspects of it, something you can pay for and pay down whatever monies you have for whatever, Social Security issues or any sort of financial aid issues as one ages.
Right.
Okay, so it's another way of putting that money aside
And
know where
being
it's
able
going.
to have the funeral that you want to have before your money runs out.
Good point. Okay. Of course, you're then subjecting your family to what you want. Right. The ultimate control issue. Yes, it's going to be my way, and I'm paying for it, and you just have to deal with it.
Absolutely.
I love it. It's control beyond the grave. And we started talking about green burials. Now, from conversations you and I have had in the past, it sounds like the Jewish traditions are like the original, if you will, green burials, or is it just that they followed through with age-old traditions before we got into embalming and cremation and everything else? I mean, are these rituals in place just because they are ancient?
Yes, they're all part of Judaism.
Okay.
And Judaism teaches that, first off, the period of mourning in Judaism doesn't begin until a body is interred in the ground.
Oh, wow.
So that's why Jewish burials usually take place very quickly.
Very quickly.
So usually within 24 to 48 hours, the burial takes place, and then the period of mourning begins.
Okay.
So it's a little bit different. It's a little bit backwards from what most people outside the Jewish faith are used to. Again, the funeral happens so quickly, and then there's usually a period of 7 days where the family then stays at home, and instead of going to a funeral home for calling hours, you pay your respects by going to the family's home.
Okay. It's not quite self-quarantining.
Correct. And that's, Zoom has become a very big part
now,
of,
now we have to,
of Shiva.
Yeah, okay. That timetable you're talking about, 24 to 48 hours, has to complicate your life quite a bit.
It's a challenge.
Well put.
We at Levine Chapels and any of the Jewish locations, we're not a local-based funeral home. We draw our business from all over the state. So many times we're dealing with families that are 10, 15, and 20 towns away from us, that we're coordinating things. Luckily today with the internet and all of that, we can do things pretty quickly, and most of the Jewish cemeteries are used to the time frame that we're working with. So in my 30 plus years, it has become routine, but certainly was not when I first started.
I would understand that. Dan mentioned that local cemeteries here in the South Shore are not necessarily geared for green burials, but where it's part of the Jewish tradition, the cemeteries you deal with obviously must be prepared to not necessarily have liners that are going to prevent a traditional Jewish burial, which, I mean, is placing, well, I mean, I'm assuming too much here, you should be telling me, but my understanding is it's cleansing a body and putting it in basically a plain pine box and putting that in the ground. I mean, that's probably oversimplification, but am I on the right track?
You're definitely on the right track. In traditional Judaism, there are so many different types of Judaism.
Yeah.
There's the Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. But if we're talking strict traditional Jewish burials, the Orthodox way of doing things, first off, going to the cemetery, many of the older Jewish cemeteries were never designed to accommodate these liners because it was not part of the faith. So liners are rarely used in a Jewish burial, which makes them green right there. Automatically.
Yeah.
Judaism says that you do nothing to slow nature down or speed nature up, that everything should be very natural. So there is no embalming. So there is no chemicals going out into the earth when a Jewish person is buried. And the casket is the traditional plain pine box, which has no nails, no stain, nothing. It's pure raw wood that is going back into the ground.
Wow.
And so, yes, the true green burials of today, they don't even use caskets.
Okay.
So, but the Jewish burial has always been a green burial per se.
It has to be by nature.
Yes.
Okay. Also, talking to time schedule, you still have to deal with regulations. You still have to deal with paperwork. I mean, if you have a death on a Friday and you need death certificates and whatever to be dealing with bodies, how does one do? I mean, is the state accommodating to that?
Again, early in my career, it was a challenge because everything was done with pen and paper.
Right.
But about 10 years ago, I believe, the state of Massachusetts has gone to an electronic death certificate.
Okay.
So now we can make phone calls to doctors, and through computers, we can exchange information back and forth, and we can now get a doctor's signature electronically. We have the ability to do all of that very quickly.
So there's a bit of irony here that it's up-to-date electronic communications that allow you to follow traditional Jewish rituals no matter when.
Correct.
Interesting.
Correct.
Interesting that one helped the other when you wouldn't expect that.
Right.
Normally regulations prevent things from happening, and this time it allows it because of electronics.
This has been the blessing.
I guess, absolutely. Again, with the clientele, does it give you a broader service area in terms of, as Dan was talking about, he's more intimately familiar with the families he deals with because they're local, they're in his community and whatever. Certainly you're not just dealing with people from Brookline.
No, as I said, we deal with people all over the state of Massachusetts and other states.
And you ship them up.
Yes, we a lot of the snowbirds come home during the winter.
Yes.
So we do a lot by phone. We can do a lot by video calls.
Okay.
We have the ability to make things very personal when the time allows. So we're able to gather all that information very quickly. We're able to contact. Most of our funerals don't happen in a church-like setting, in a temple.
Right.
Most temple funerals in the past have been geared towards, it's not the place you have the funeral in Judaism. So the temple, you only went really to temple if you were like the president of the temple, you were active in the temple, things like that. It's a much different thing. Graveside services in Judaism are very, very common, and services in our facility. But of course, COVID has changed all of that.
Right. Oh, God, yeah. It's changed everything. But does that also speak to why, I mean, you mentioned the two different size chapels. You have the 75 and the 200?
200 to 300, depending
200 to 300.
upon...
So you can accommodate a rather large crowd. I mean, something you would otherwise need a church or temple to accommodate.
Correct.
But you do it on site, and that's how you can do it on site, is you have a big enough chapel.
Correct. There's never enough parking, but there's always...
Yes, I keep bringing up parking, and now you're kind of agreeing with me.
Yes.
Parking is an issue in Brookline, no matter how. But
Right.
we find it here too. A big enough funeral is always a game changer when it comes to traffic patterns. And I'm going to ask you also the question about avocation per. Okay, you grew up in Brockton, and you didn't start out in the business. Were you with the telephone company or something?
I
initially?
was. I was a long-distance operator for New England Telephone.
Okay.
And we went through the divestiture of the phone company.
And at some point you decided.
Yes, it's, I come from an Italian background.
Okay.
And
No, really?
And when my parents are from in Italy, there is no such thing as a funeral director.
Interesting.
That, you take care of your own.
Right.
So I grew up seeing photo albums of all of these family funerals that my family actually handled
right.
in their homes.
Right.
So it was always a morbid curiosity that I had. And one night at the funeral, at the phone company, I was speaking to one of my colleagues who had a good friend who was a funeral director. She introduced me to him, and the rest is history. It was my calling.
Wow, it certainly has become it if it wasn't to begin with, so that's amazing. And I'm going to ask you in summary or in ending the same ending question I asked Dan about, because I'm aware that final plans can take on some interesting twists and turns. What's been the most unusual?
We've had a couple of very well-known people in the world.
Okay.
And for us, we've had Dixieland jazz bands that have, it's
Something
very...
you wouldn't expect in that tradition.
Correct, very untraditional, but we've been able to work them in to the tradition
Okay.
appropriately. We've had a couple of Ave Marias at times.
Really?
Yeah, we had one fairly religious person whose son-in-law was an opera singer.
Wow.
And he just let out with the Ave Maria in the middle of the service.
There
And
you go.
It was actually fitting.
Well, Christ was Jewish, so it kind of fits in that sense.
Yes.
Anyway, now, so you've been here for the entire presentation. What have I forgotten, or what haven't I touched upon? Do you think that the viewers need to know, or should know, or might be interested to know?
Unfortunately, death in the past has been something that is shunned. It is, as Dan mentioned, it's a conversation that needs to happen. Just so that no one is caught off guard. It's not a topic that anyone should be afraid of. Parents should be having the conversation with children, allowing the children, most people have pets, and pets die, and they have little funerals in the backyard, and that's okay to have, but
Right.
when a loved one dies, suddenly it's an unspoken topic.
Right.
So my thing is communication, communication, communication.
Absolutely.
Talk to your loved ones.
And I can personally relate to it. My mom passed before my dad, and he really wanted his three sons to plan everything. And we followed through with what we thought maybe the family wanted, maybe not even what we wanted. And when my dad eventually passed away about 10 years ago, my brothers were, scanning the will looking for his wishes, and they weren't in there. But he and I had the discussion. Of course, what he really wanted, and you just mentioned it, he wanted the Dixieland thing with the procession and everything. Of course, he died in January. That wasn't going to happen. So we did our best, and I think that's what any family needs to look at the time. And I mean, we did a reception afterwards with a jazz trio over a meal, and it became a party, and that was him. That was exactly what he wanted. So we found a way, even if we couldn't do the letter of what he maybe wanted. I think my brothers were shocked when I said Dixieland. Yeah, no. But the communications happen, no matter how they happen, but obviously it's best if they're written down, if the discussions occur.
Well, what's important to remember is that in many families there's usually more than one person. And when something isn't pre-planned, everybody has a different relationship with their loved one.
Yes.
And they think that they know that person better than each person. So there's a little bit of everybody wants to have their say and everything else. So if it's pre-planned, it's right there in paper.
Again, control from beyond the grave.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you coming
Thank
to
you
talk
for inviting
about
me. This was a pleasure.
Pleasure for us as well. And it gives us some insight into things that Abington, Rockland, and Whitman don't necessarily have to deal with. But hopefully by learning about this, our audience is perhaps more open to things like this. Or if they find a need to plan a burial more along this line, they know that there are people available to help them plan such things. So I think it's been very valuable to the audience here. So I'm going to thank Tony, and we're going to sign off now and be seeing you on cable and on YouTube. And we will next be chatting with you again about the Grand Army of the Republic halls in the 3 towns, and taking a little field trip to Rockland to see their facility. And there's some interesting stories there. Wait till I tell you about the cannons. But we're signing off for now from the Dyer Memorial Library, and we thank Paul, our cameraman, for making all this happen today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Dividing we fall in so righteous a cause, let us hope to succeed. For heaven approves of each generous deed. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady, not as slaves, but as free men, our money will give.